All right, what's up, everyone? Thanks for tuning in this week. Today, we are digging in to 2/5. Specifically, if you're someone who feels like, ugh, I don't really have this part of my musicianship quite together yet, today we're going to talk about some strategies and specifically some licks that you can start with that will get you working on this part of your improvisational language. So, to set the stage for today's content, I want you to go back to maybe early 2000s, the year 2000, maybe 2001, to a high school age Sean Bell just starting to work on his improvisational stuff. So I grew up in rural Michigan. I didn't go to a high school that had a huge band program. In fact, we didn't even have a jazz band until the last 2 years of high school. Luckily, my parents were very encouraging of me as a young musician, and they would do things like send me to different music camps in the summer. And also, for example, they would drive me about 45 minutes to an hour one way to a community college that was in an area that did have a jazz band that I could enroll in, at least get some stuff working, even though I didn't have a lot of access to really great pedagogy at that time. I went to Western Michigan University for my undergrad, and at that school at that time, if you were a trombone student, and whether you're going to do classical or jazz trombone, you took classical trombone lessons for at least the 2 first years of your undergrad. So there I was, working on Rochu, working on Grandal, all that type of stuff, which I'm actually very thankful that I got that experience now later in my life. But I quickly found I was really behind my fellow jazz students. Lucky for me, there was still an individual living in that town, Kalamazoo, Michigan, by the name of Raphael Crawford, great trombone player in Chicago now. He had graduated several years before I got to Western, and he was kind of still in town, and we actually got together to do some lessons for the first year I was in school. The very first thing he had me start working on was learning licks and transcribing. This proved to be the key component of why I really had a long way to go, because even though I knew all the music theory, knew the arpeggios, knew the scales, I had absolutely no context of what to do with them. So on this channel, I talk a lot about learning vocabulary, learning licks, transcribing, going to the recordings, and that is because that was what really worked for me in my development, and I really think it works for many people. All right, now that we've got some of that stuff out of the way, let's actually dig into these licks that we're going to look at today. We're going to look at 3 short 2/5s and 2 long 2/5s. Since we're talking about being at the beginning phases of learning these 2/5/1s, I selected licks that would be appropriate for this. They're relatively straightforward from a harmonic sort of standpoint, and they're also very, very common. These are like 2/5/1 licks 101. This is stuff that all jazz musicians play, really common parts of the language. Each one of these we're going to play and have just a short little analysis about sort of how I think about them at least, and try to keep these things straight in my head when I'm practicing. You know, when I really play these, I can't say I really think about all this music theory anymore. There was certainly a time when I probably did, and if you're just getting started on this, you will probably need to lean on some of that music theory to help you just build these licks and move them to different keys. Now, it's definitely more my ear that's guiding me, and that's where you want to get to. That comes with practice. All right, here is lick number 1. I should also add, we're going to look at every example today in the key of B flat. Cool. As far as 2/5/1s go, it doesn't get more basic than that. When we're looking at this lick, we could label the whole thing with sort of a scale degree analysis. We're looking at the chord of the moment. So when we're thinking in terms of C, we're going to think, all right, that E flat is the flat third of C. We're not necessarily relating it back to B flat here. We're looking at the chord of the moment. So it's flat third, down to second, down to root, down to the flat 7. That resolves to the third of the next chord. Then we get that flat 9 in there, root to the flat 7 to the third of the next chord. So basically what we're doing is we're connecting the thirds. We're going from the third of C to the third of A to the third of B. And we have the sevenths to kind of connect those flat sevenths to third. That's classic voice leading through these chords, and that's why this lick sort of sounds like it makes sense. That second way of thinking about it, where I'm really just looking at the key moments of the lick, not worrying about necessarily every single note in there, but just looking at those key moments of voice leading is really how I like to think about analyzing these and keeping them all straight as I practice them. Now, as I mentioned, there is a flat 9 in here. There's that G flat on the F chord. You can play a flat 9, you can play a natural 9. It really doesn't matter. You know, the flat 9 is going to make it sound slightly different. The natural 9 is going to sound slightly more major. They're both going to sound good. They happen very, very quickly. So try not to get bogged down too much on which one of those is like right. Choose which one you like to sound more of, whether you like it as a flat 9 or a natural 9, and do it that way as you transpose it through the keys. All right, on to lick number 2. Again, super, super common part of the language. If I'm thinking about how I would analyze this, I'm thinking I start on the fifth of the 2 chord, and then I just go down through the arpeggio of that chord. Again, getting my 7th to 3rd resolution, classic voice leading. And then the last part of the idea, I have an enclosure. So I know my eventual target note is the 5th of the 1 chord, in this case the F natural. So I'm going to be above it by a half step, then below it by 2 half steps. So that little enclosure shape, I'm trying to think about that as a chunk rather than just as a bunch of like accidentals. I could think maybe I'm jumping up to the flat 9 of that F chord, but I'm really trying to think about enclosures to kind of keep that straight in my head. All right, lick number 3. Again, our quick analysis, what makes this tick? Well, I'm connecting roots now. I'm going from the root of the 2 chord to the root of the 5 chord to the root of the 1 chord. I have a little chromatic passing note in there, so I can connect those roots and land on that F on the downbeat of that chord. There's that, I guess that's the flat 3rd to the major 3rd on the minor chord. We might think, well, Sean, that can't be right. Why are you playing the major 3rd on a minor chord? It's a passing note. It's going to sound good. It's going to the F. I should add here that this lick would also sound really good if you played it in the upper octave and would still lay nice on the horn. Every item of vocabulary is not going to work that way. Some things you can freely play in the higher octave, lower octave, it's all going to sit okay, but some of them might only fit in 1 octave. And some things, when you go to a different key, maybe it doesn't work so well anymore. All right, there's a couple of short 2/5s. That's usually where I like to start with students. They're a little simpler, a little less information to learn. They're also great to manipulate, kind of stretch the rhythms out. You can make them work over long 2/5s. Really, really useful. Let's move on to our actual long 2/5s. We're only going to do 2 of these. They're a little more complicated, so there's more information to kind of keep track of. But again, these are both really good ones to start with. They don't have a lot of like crazy harmonic stuff going on. They're relatively straightforward from a music theory standpoint. Again, our quick analysis here, we start on the 5th of our 2 chord, and then we move down through the arpeggio, but then we have this root to 5th, major 7 to 5th, flat 7 to 5th. That's a really common little jazz sort of cliche, you might say, and then it eventually resolves to the 3rd of the 5 chord. Super important little nugget of voice leading to get under your fingers. From there, we sort of move around in the scale. That's going to work on the 5 chord, but there's a little enclosure at the end of this lick around the root of the 1 chord. So for me, the key moments of this are all about that on the 2 chord, the root to the major 7 to the flat 7, connecting to the 3rd of the 2 chord, or excuse me, the 3rd of the 5 chord, and then landing on the root of the 1 chord. Cool, and then let's look at our last one. Now this one has a little bit of like rhythm stuff happening in it. These don't have to be just 8th notes. That's how a lot of times people practice them. But we can have other rhythms going on in there as well. So this one has a little bit of syncopation. And our final little analysis on this one. So the first part is mostly just the scale. It doesn't hit the 6th degree of that scale. It's really like sort of C minor Dorian or maybe C minor bebop, depending on how you want to think about it. You could really think scale degrees if you want to. And then there are some enclosures in the top half here. We go up to that flat 7 of C, and then we actually enclose around the 3rd of the F chord with a little bit of different rhythm in there. So it's not maybe as straightforward. And then again, some enclosure type of things, or excuse me, just some scalar type of things happening to get into the 3rd of the 1 chord. That one's a little trickier, but definitely something that if you worked on a few of these, I think you'd be able to get under your fingers reasonably well. Cool. So there's some licks to get you started. The question is, how do I practice these? And what do I do with these once I learn them? The first thing you need to do is you need to work them with a metronome. This is the type of practice nobody likes to do. This just sort of steady work with a metronome. In all honesty, it's boring. It's not fun to practice this way. But I don't know many good musicians who haven't spent some amount of time working on ideas in this way. Maybe it's not absolutely 2-5-1 licks, maybe it's scale patterns, maybe it's different just melodic shapes, but working them with a metronome, it helps get your time together. It gives you an objective measuring stick to be like, can I actually execute this, at 90 beats a minute? Then can I actually execute it at 190 beats a minute and see kind of where the line is? So the metronome is incredibly important here. To work them with the metronome, you're going to want to move them through some different keys. Now, the classic way to do this would be to do all 12 keys. If you're just getting started on this, that might be kind of challenging. So set yourself a more reasonable expectation, maybe 4 keys or 6 keys. Start with some keys that are in the tunes that you actually play. Just to demonstrate this process and how sort of like dry it can be, but how necessary it is. I'm going to play one of these licks through 4 keys. I'm going to go through the keys of C, F, B flat, and E flat. Really common key signatures that lots of tunes appear in, and you need to have this stuff together in. I'm going to play this short 2-5. I'm going to set my metronome to 120 beats a minute. I'm going to do it 2 times in each key with just a little bit of pause in between to make sure I'm in the right starting note, or on the right starting note, excuse me, as I get to that new key. So let's check it out. Again, super boring, but super necessary. Cool, now I might give myself a chance to think about the next chord and where I'm starting. It's a 2-5 to F, so the 2 chord is a G minor chord. I'm starting on the 5th, so that is gonna be a D. So then I'm gonna find the time and give it a try 2 times in that key. Cool, on to the next key, B flat. I might also be trying to connect with the general roadmap of this, like we talked about. I start on the 5th of the 2 chord, and then I have that little enclosure around the 3rd, or excuse me, the 5th of the eventual 1 chord I'm landing on. Those are my key moments in this lick. And then finally, when I get to the key of E flat here, I'd have to make a decision. Do I want to play in my upper octave or my lower octave? Here, really both ranges would be effective. I'm going to play in my lower octave here just to demonstrate and make sure there's good clarity. Cool, once you get this confident in those 4 or 6 keys, when you move it to the other keys, it's going to be a lot easier to move it to like the key of E major if you know it in E flat major, just because we're more confident in E flat major as brass players because we play in those keys more. That doesn't mean we don't want to eventually work in those more challenging keys, but the process will likely go a little bit quicker for you, especially if you haven't worked this stuff very much. Now, if you feel confident transposing to all keys quickly, go for it. You know, that's the way I practice this stuff when I still work on different ideas, is in all 12 keys for the most part, but starting in a more limited number of keys can really be successful if you're earlier on in that process. Cool, that is all we've got for today. Now, this sort of practice, sometimes I find my local students, some of my online students, struggle to really put the time in here, you know, because like I said, it's a little bit boring. It can seem like, where's the application? Where's the music making? This is very cut and paste. The idea is not to just be a lick player, quote unquote. It's to take these ideas, use them to help digest the jazz language, try to practice applying them on some tunes. You do that enough, it's going to start to feel like, oh, I'm actually hearing these ideas now. It's not just a cut and paste experience. It actually is becoming part of the way that you speak the language, especially if you work on this for a year or two, learning a variety of licks that work in a variety of contexts. You'll really find that you have a much broader set of ideas to pull from, and you start to pull, okay, well, I'm going to take a little bit of this lick over here, combine it with this lick over here. I'm going to get between the two things in a way that I've never played before. Suddenly you sound like a pretty organic improviser. I don't think many people who are improvising aren't doing some amount of that, where they're drawing on information that's sort of floating around in their head that they've practiced, combining it in unique ways to create in the moment. Cool. I'll see you in the woodshed.